Dort hinten, wo die Straße jetzt eine Kurve macht, da war...
Back there, long logs were lying where the road curves, and beyond, at the curve just in front of the forest, there where it goes into the forest, I once made recordings of the whirring sounds of Semjase's beamship.
Vom Strahlschiff von Semjase.
You could hear it over a very big area, up to a distance of 4 kilometers.
Wendell Stevens,
Lee Elders, and Tom Welch got a measuring device from Weil Limited up in Rheintal.
Da ist eine Firma mit elektronischen Geräten. Haben sie ausgemessen, wie weit die
A company with electronic devices, and measured the distance from here to there about 380 meters, which made it possible for the sounds to be recorded from here.
Dafür waren, dass von hier aus die Geräusche überhaupt noch aufgenommen werden konnten.
Is the 10 different frequencies are converging on one central frequency, which is, I find, very interesting. This is probably one of the most interesting things about the tape, is that there are...
What's this right now?
Very, very many tones.
Yeah.
And they're all changing very fast. Not synthesizers on the market that have oscillators that change that randomly. Even if you got 9 or 10 of them going, they wouldn't change from those peaks that quickly.
So a significant thing is this rate of change.
And besides, if you were going to create a noise for a spaceship, you'd be hard put to come up with something as original as this.
I would see it once a week or sometimes twice a week, ship over the Ashoka Ashram, but from an angle behind the Ashoka Ashram, there's a little hill, and we used to call it the Dog Hill. This was taken on May 24, 1964. This was taken just on the side towards the east of the ashram. Sometimes I would see more than 2, there would be a whole bunch of them. Taken from monuments in that area. It's called the Qutub Minar. This is an old Indian historical monument. Very interesting and also important to me, a whole bunch of them. But this is one of my ayah washing my clothes, sitting on the veranda outside my room. When I had my experience, I have seen a lot of ships over the trees, near the well, on the doghouse. Sometimes it was very low. I could see a huge half of this room size of the ship. So when I had experiences with Asket, it was also not something very unusual or strange for me. It was almost a return to some familiar state. Sometimes there would be a few villagers walking around and they would look up and see this. In the ashram itself, sometimes our servant would come and said, I saw something very strange. Have you seen? I would say yes, and that was the end of it. This is right on top of the ashram in the evening. Sometimes there would be people looking up with me, looking up, and some of them would see the ship very clearly like myself, but some would look at them and said, I don't see it. This is one of the phenomena where hundreds of people saw this. Even was written in the Indian newspaper in the 60s. Actually, one reporter was dispatched from the newspaper, I think the New Statesman or something. He came, talked to the villagers, talked to people who work at our place, and even talked to Billy and was shown the photos.
Während einer Nachtwache von mir, da hatte ich mein Fahrzeug,
During my night watch, I parked my car just here. Everything was dark here, and I came walking along this road.
heraufgelaufen und wie ich hier so entlang laufe.
As I was walking along, Ptah and his shiny little ship came over this hill, brightly illuminated between the trees over the tent there.
Mit seinem Schiff hier so über das Center, hell beleuchtet.
Die ganze Situation nach bald 20 Jahren ist etwas derartig Normales, dass
The whole situation after 25 years is somewhat normal, and we deal with such unusual phenomena quite differently.
im Februar, das war, ich schätze 2001, ich habe es mal aufgeschrieben.
I had another interesting experience. I guess it was in February 2001. I wrote about it. I drove my car into the protection shield of a telemeter disc.
Mit meinem Auto und da wurde das ganze Auto in einen riesigen Lichtball.
That means that I touched the electroenergetic protection shield of that disk with my car, and the whole car was enveloped in a huge ball of light.
In einem Auto, es war ein helles, orange leuchtendes Licht und an der Peripherie meines Fahrzeuges konnte ich
It was as if my car and I were struck by a very strong electrical tension.
elektrische Ladung entlädt rund um mein Fahrzeug.
Mitte der 80er Jahre war ich in Italien in den Ferien.
In the mid-80s, I was on vacation in Italy, and one night about 11, I had an impulse and I looked, and there were two lights, quite parallel, very fast, and then they whoosh, parted, and then I knew. Yeah, that was it.
Ja, das war's jetzt. Also Außerirdische habe ich sicher noch nicht gesehen. Raumschiffe, ja, also irgendwas.
I've certainly never yet seen extraterrestrials, but spaceships, yeah, something silvery in the sky. Well, I have to say that I have simply never been interested in spaceships. Spaceships are, for me, like cars. I'm not interested in cars either. They are a means of transportation. But what has always been clear to me, and what I never quite realized, was that it was clear to me that, logically, there are extraterrestrials. We here on Earth certainly are not the only ones in this huge universe.
In diesem riesigen Universum.
So, Mike, what's this photograph that we see here?
This is a photograph that Billy Meier took in 1975 of a landed UFO, the only one of this type that he was able to take. It was from this photograph that the special effects expert Wally Gentleman, who had been a director of special effects in 2001, designed and had made two UFO models at the MGM Special Effects Studio. In these photographs, we see Billy Meier with those models.
You mean 2001, the Kubrick film?
Yes.
And what's the difference between these models versus, photographs that Billy Meier took of actual UFOs?
Well, I think we're going to take a look at some of that. For instance, here we can see in this film the model, one of the models being handheld and walked about the property. There were very specific technical differences that were observed, but in this film, we see an object that some people might say is a model. It's hovering above what appears to be a tree and in front of a house.
Is this one of his films? Or?
This is one of Billy Meier's films, his earliest film from 1975. Some people would think by a string, but as you see this move off to the side, you notice the UFO hung for a moment at an angle, which is something that's impossible to effect with an object on a string.
But it looks like so shaky and like being pulled up and down.
Yes.
And is this the usual way they fly?
No, this was a demonstration flight, and some of what was accomplished here was the characteristic and to be expected movements would come from an object, a pendulum-like object, an object on a string. And then we see these other smooth and flowing movements as the UFO is moving about the tree. We're told that this was done for a couple of reasons. One, to actually demonstrate flight in a terrestrial environment, and two, to also give an out to skeptics who would have to say this cannot be an object from outer space. It would be too threatening to their belief systems. However, at a certain point, we can actually see the top of this tree swaying under the backwash of the UFO. And if we look back at the very opening of this film, we will notice that there's a great deal of space between the UFO and the sky, making it very, very unlikely that it could be an object suspended on a string.
And why is this film so blurry and looks like an old film? I mean,
well, it is an old film, shot in 1975 on a snowy and rainy day, according to Meier, and shot from a distance. So what we're seeing here is a rather poor quality film, to be sure. And we're just having to make the best of it ourselves in our understanding.
Is this tree still there today?
The tree is no longer there, as is the case in a couple of the other films and photographs that Meier took.
And what do we see here?
Here is a much clearer film segment that Meier took with a UFO hovering above a road, and we can see a car moving slowly to the left in the bottom.
Oh yeah, that white dot there, yeah.
The white dot. We're going to see another one in a moment. We also notice that there is a tree branch with some leaves to the left. Meier was encouraged oftentimes to have objects in the foreground for perspective and calculating the distance. Here the craft is moved suddenly to the left, and it's exhibiting a characteristic floating motion that we're told is really the craft riding on the magnetic field of the Earth. In this film, we can see an object, a toy made in the 1990s, invented by physicists, called a levitron, that exhibits this type of movement as this object in these repeated frames floats above the base. We dissolve here into Meier's UFO as it too is exhibiting that type of hovering, pulsing movement on the magnetic field of the Earth as he was told. Now watch as the object will suddenly dart away in one frame, disappearing from view.
How is that possible?
Meier was told that they have technologies that allow them to move out of phase, out of dimension, within a part of a second. They can not only move out of dimension that quickly, they can also pop back into dimension. When the films were examined at Nippon TV, they discovered that indeed there had been no cutting and that the object not only disappears in one frame, but pops back in one frame just as suddenly as you see here.
So where does it go while it's gone?
Well, that's a good question. As we observe it here disappear one more time, we can wonder just exactly where it goes. I don't have an answer for it. That's Billy Meier in the lower middle of the film. He's walked into the film. He'd set up his camera on a tripod as we again see one of the UFOs hovering in the distance. And again, notice that it has this movement, this slight pulsing up and down movement as it rides on the magnetic field of the Earth.
And this film?
This film, Meier has the UFO as it comes in closer. He also zooms in on it a bit, and we will see two very dramatic effects of a light flashing there from the top.
There, yeah.
You see it? And then from the rim of the ship.
Why is it flashing like that?
That was not explained. As a matter of fact, when Meier mentioned it to them, to the extraterrestrials, they were surprised at that effect, and they wanted to see the film too. We see it again go on there. Now, as you watch this film, in a moment you're going to be able to observe more clearly that the craft is actually above the Earth. There's a bit of a hill or mountain just below the time codes there. So clearly this was photographed outside. This was filmed outside. And this is one of the films that the owners of Uncharted Territory, the Academy Award-winning special effects house, they viewed this film and determined that it was not a hoax. In this film, we see three of the UFOs, again in the distance with tree branches in the foreground, as they hover at slightly different angles in relationship to each other, exhibiting again the pulsing movement and changing distance ever so minutely between them. Uncharted Territory said that if they could duplicate Meier's films, they would have to go to CGI to do it because these clearly are not models.
And what is this right here?
This is the beginning of a series of photographs that Meier took of what's called a light or energy ship, allegedly piloted by beings from the Andromeda Galaxy who are partially physical and partially non-physical. Very high-level, high-energy beings. They did not communicate directly with Meier, and he could not communicate with them. Interestingly enough, Lee and Britt Elders, two of the original investigators on the case, claimed that they also saw a phenomenon in the night skies like this in Switzerland while they were investigating the case. Photoshop expert David Biedny claimed that Meier had simply used a light fixture photographed against a black background to hoax these photographs, in particular one that he claimed was a double exposure. When another special effects movie expert who'd been in the business for 50 years viewed the same photograph that we're about to see in just a moment, he said that it was not a double exposure at all, but a triple exposure that must have been taken accidentally in camera. When Mr. Biedny was challenged to duplicate this photo to prove his point, he declined to even try.
Is it this photograph right here?
This is the one. Now in the next one, this one, which is clearly not a double exposure, Mr. Biedny wouldn't even comment on it. This poses a problem for the skeptics because it clearly was not done outside the camera.
And what is this thing that looks so interesting?
Well, that's our wedding cake UFO. This was the only other landed UFO that Meier was able to take photographs of. And interestingly enough, in very much the same location as the energy ship when it was photographed in the previous photographs, right above the center. We see here a more clear view of the base of the ship taken from this angle, and as we get closer to it, even a little more clarity. These photos of the wedding cake UFO were called hoaxes by many people who thought that it was merely a garbage can lid with various appliances and accessories somehow put onto it. However, when the original investigators were able to calculate the measurement, it turned out to be some 10 feet in diameter. When they took these photos to a metallurgist to ask if he could reproduce it in 1980 or 81, he said it would cost about $25,000 to make this object. Here, an even larger wedding cake UFO is photographed over a van on Meier's property, and Meier photographs it as well from underneath. These are very controversial photographs of the wedding cake UFO glowing a golden color at night. Here you can see various artifacts, trees, and perhaps light poles in the background. In this next photograph, Meier has a close-up of it, even larger, closer to the camera. And here, a telemeter disc moves off to the side, and the photograph of the tree and the car caused problems for skeptics who claim that this is really just a model tree and a model car. Here we can see the most dramatic of those photos as Meier photographs focusing on the distant large UFO, which is behind the car and not in front of it. Here the object is now clearer, hovering, and we can see the base of the UFO at night as it glows golden color with various protuberances underneath. In this next photograph, the center or the core, the top core of the UFO, the sleeve has been extended. If you take your time to do some measurements on it, you'll see that it's actually a different configuration.
When was this video taken?
This was taken in 1981, outside. Meier has the camera set up. This is his first video camera. And the UFO here is about 200 to 300 feet in the distance as best we can calculate. Meier snaps some of the photographs here. He'll then leave the frame. He'll go out of frame again for a while before coming back in. Some skeptics had claimed that this was really false perspective, that it was small model trees set up close to the camera. For anybody that's been to Switzerland, rural parts as well, and especially near where Meier lives, many solitary trees appear on these hillsides, and they look all too good to be true unless you're familiar with the fact that there's a very vibrant life force. The trees are clear, solitary in many occasions. Here, this solitary tree has the UFO hovering virtually motionlessly in front of it.
How is that possible? In the other films, it was moving. Here, it's like standing still.
Well, it seems that the UFOs can be controlled consciously by the Plejaren. People have to think that through for themselves and see if they accept that idea. This is a photograph, a formerly top-secret photograph of one of the Nazi UFOs, the German UFOs that were developed during the early part of the Second World War, supposedly with the help of extraterrestrials who, upon further determining the nefarious intentions of the Nazis, input into the designs elements that caused these craft to not be able to function as the Germans had hoped they would. Nonetheless, it's said that during the Second World War there was an intense bombing run by the Allies. 800 bombers were sent up. Only 2 of these craft were sent up and were able to destroy 200 of the Allied bombers, according to Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Stevens.
How did the Nazis supposedly get these UFOs?
Supposedly they were helped by an extraterrestrial race that thought that the Germans at the time would develop and utilize these craft to bring about a more peaceful world here. And this only goes to show that, extraterrestrial or not, whenever human beings are involved in something, things can and ultimately will get messed up.
You mean they talked to the Nazis and gave them UFOs?
They apparently input the information telepathically to Nazis, or at the time German scientists, who were unaware of the contacts themselves. They thought that they were developing these objects themselves. And after the Second World War, some of these objects survived, and some of the Germans fled to South America with them. Different countries came into possession of these plans, such as the United States, Canada, Russia, and England. Other countries as well, later, such as France and China, developed this type of alternative craft, which, while it does not have the capability of true interplanetary, let alone interstellar spacecraft, is used even today to create UFO sightings around the world. So we are told by the play Aaron and Meier that the greater majority of so-called UFO sightings are actually craft that are U.S. and other secret military craft. The danger still being that a false UFO ET attack could be launched by one country or another in order to bring people under martial law and worldwide control. These are the only known photographs taken from within a UFO above the Earth with two other UFOs visible. Meier took these from inside Semyaze's ship. In this final photograph, we even get a clearer view of the Earth and land below. We're looking at photographs taken of Meier holding a laser beam-type weapon on July 6, 1977. The photographer is the woman Manara who brought him this weapon, an antique 600-year-old beam-type weapon.
He looks a lot younger here than in the movie.
He was about 40 years old at this time.
And this is like another film of his?
This is shot on the same day. This was actually the second time that a weapon like this was brought to Meier, and they decided to both photograph and film him handling the weapon during this time.
So does anyone else ever touch this weapon, or was Meier the only one?
Well, Meier was the only terrestrial person to handle the weapon. Manara was the person who brought it, and another woman named Alina. Also, we'll see her in a little bit. We have some photographs of her. The weapon had some very unusual characteristics.
Like what?
Well, the weapon was said to have a range of 37.2 kilometers, and it had a screen on it that Meier could look into and see up to that distance as if whatever he was looking at was close at hand. All he had to do was concentrate then on the target, whether it would be a little piece of a tree or another vehicle or whatever, and press the trigger, pull back on the trigger, and that beam would travel as far as necessary to destroy the object in question.
So he could basically steer the weapon with his mind?
Well, this weapon wasn't fully steerable with the mind. It was more that he could focus on whatever he wanted to. He still had to pull the trigger. In their more recent technology, they have weapons that are controlled by the mind, so that only the so-called owner of the weapon can actually activate and use it. It doesn't require the use then of a trigger, but rather is mentally controlled by the weapon's owner. We're looking at a film made 30 years ago of a weapon that is, at the time, allegedly 600 years old.
Who is this holding the
Well,
weapon?
this is Alina. She's another extraterrestrial who comes from a very, very distant system in space, and she is holding the weapon here. We see not only the weapon, but this gold suit. What we should tell you is that when Wendell Stevens and the investigative team first saw these photographs and films, they thought, number one, that the weapon had to be a toy, which they discovered it wasn't by searching out every toy supplier in Switzerland as well as toy stores and coming up with nothing. Likewise, they searched out through sporting goods stores and clothing manufacturers this type of an outfit, as well as simply looking for a fabric that would behave and appear as the apparent gold foil of Alina's outfit does. They couldn't find that either.
And what is this? What's with this tree?
Well, this is one of the two trees that Meier shot holes through using this weapon. This appears to be the apple tree, about 10 to 12 inches in diameter. The investigators couldn't even find a drill bit that long, and plus, as they examined the hole here, they found out that not only was it smooth as glass all the way through, but slightly oval, in addition to the round entrance and exit. There is no possible way of drilling an oval hole.
What about these pictures?
Well, this is another tree in a forest that Meier had shot a hole through. The investigators had then taken a string, tied it around the trunk, ran it through the hole, and then carried it back all the way into the forest. They found it in a straight line from the entrance point of this hole. Everything was singed or burned perfectly all the way through as far as they could walk it in the forest. But remarkably, there was no sap bubbling. There was simply clean through, immediate breaks in the branches and twigs where the beam had passed through.
With any technology that I know of could not achieve this on this Earth plane. I could not explain the type of material that I have and its discreteness by any known combination of materials. I could not put it together myself. The elements that we found were totally surprising. The major element, which is shown here, was the rare earth metal thulmium, Thulium. It was totally unexpected. So now we've seen silicon, iron, thulmium, silver, and copper, all in a specimen about this big.
When he examined the metal under electron scanning microscope, he then found the micro-machining, which was a clear evidence to him that this was a deliberately manufactured product.
We found evidence of what looks like mechanical manipulation. One sees now discrete marks in a diagonal form in this direction and marks in this direction. But what is exciting, it looks like it's been plowed. In other words, a pressure, and there is a scarfing on either side.
Do we know what this metal is used for?
We're told that these metals were representative of a number of the different stages, 7 stages of manufacturing that the Plejaren go through to create the metal for their spacecraft.
I don't know how beneficial it would be for us. They're always more advanced than we are, so we're the savages in the jungle, and that's not always beneficial for the lesser evolved person. But they're here studying us, and we should know about it, I think.
If these ETs exist, why haven't they contacted us?
Well, actually, there's 2 answers. Number one is they certainly did try to contact us, meaning the government of the United States, in 1979. There was a letter sent to the Carter administration. But when I read that letter, I really understood why the contact didn't take place. It really was demanding such profound